quite enough people for the beginners.
For the level.
The level one.
For who is it for?
Well, now my son, the second one, Alex.
Yeah.
I should introduce this because this is
Director of Alumni and Special Projects, and Nadim has determined that introducing and welcoming you tonight is one of my special projects. So I'm here at LAU in 13 years. We're happy that you're here. We hope you enjoyed a little bit of the reception, and I know we're going to enjoy this talk. We are very honored to have Hassan with us, and maybe you'll get interested and purchase the books afterwards. So I'm going to turn it over to Nadim.
Thank you.
Nadim Shehadi is the director of our academic center. He's been with us about 8 months now, something like that. So,
Thank you.
Do we have to hold this?
I think people can hear us, right?
Okay.
Why don't you guys come closer? You're so far. It's not a crowded
Yes.
room. We have
It's more
seats.
cozy if you come.
yeah, move up, please.
Okay, so we have a, before we start, a video message from London, which is going to be played now. Is it? From your friend Riz, who unfortunately couldn't make it with us.
Hello, this is Rizwan, and I'm really sorry I couldn't be there today to talk about The Responsible Globalist. It's an incredibly exciting book. I think it holds a lot of the keys that we're looking for to unlock a better future, a future that's less divided, that's more cooperative, and one that's filled with hope. Hassan's someone I've known for a long time, and his optimism has often frustrated me, but I can say that with this book, it's sober analysis, and yet it's really practical insights into a way forwards. It may have won me around and away from my natural tendency towards good old-fashioned British cynicism. So thank you, Hassan, for this amazing contribution. Sorry I couldn't be there, and enjoy.
Thank you. Let's start with, who are you? I mean, I know that we all know that you work for Bill Gates and for the foundation. You're in charge of global something.
So my name is Hassan Damluji. I have 3 passports. I have Irish, Iraqi, and British. I'm married with a small kid. my whole career has been focused initially from the starting point of saying, as someone who's from Iraq, but has had more opportunity, even than my own cousins, you know, privileged as they were growing up in Baghdad compared to other Iraqis, even than my own first cousins, I had way more opportunity than them. And certainly compared to the average Iraqi. So how selfish would it be to just go and try and make money or whatever and not actually use some of that opportunity to contribute in Iraq? And from there, a focus on education, because we figured that you have to be good at something or know something in order to then contribute. So I figured education, you know, everyone in my family is a doctor except me, right? Like probably the Lebanese in the audience will sympathize with that. You know, you have to be a doctor or... Yeah. And so I wasn't a doctor, so health is a good way of fixing the world. I couldn't do that. So I thought, okay, well, education is another one. So why don't I become an expert in education? So those are the kind of twin threads that led me to where I am today. I worked in the Middle East for some years doing education reform, and was hired by the Gates Foundation to set up their Middle East office 6.5 years ago, where the ask was to say, look, can we have someone who speaks the language, understands the region, understands the kind of very corporate, you know, who can talk to Bill Gates in the kind of language of business, because that's ultimately the language that we communicate in the foundation, but that also understands development. So they ran out of good options. Eventually they came back to me, who they talked to from the beginning. Said, actually, maybe we do like you. And actually, then when they offered me the job, I said, no, I don't want to do this. And the reason was because we don't do work in Iraq, for the same reason we don't do work in Lebanon. And the reason is that what we do at the Gates Foundation is focused on absolute poverty. And because we're a big pot of money, just trying to be smart money, ultimately we have money and we have to decide where to put it, where problem is political rather than financial, we can't solve that problem, and so we'd be wasting our money. And so, so I thought, well, this is no use to me. I eventually was won round to the idea that actually, and this is really interesting work. So I've been doing that for the last 6.5 years, and now my portfolio is the Middle East, Pakistan, Japan, and Korea. So those are the geographies that I have teams that work in. And we're really on the hook for a couple of things. So in answer to your original question, which was global what? It's global policy and advocacy. So what does that mean? So really we're the teams that in these geographies are on the hook for creating leverage, which is to say, if we as a foundation, we spend about $6 billion a year. Yeah, $6 billion a year. Now, that's by far the biggest foundation in the world, and we think it's the source of wealth is two people, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. A lot of people don't know Warren Buffett gave us 85% of his money, so he didn't put his name above the door, which is an amazing thing. Two very wealthy people, that's a lot, 6 billion is a lot. But actually, when you look at the problems we're trying to solve, it's a rounding error. It's a rounding error compared to global aid, the grants that are given, most of which are from governments. And then all of global aid is a rounding error when you compare it to the money that's needed to actually develop countries. And so here's my claim that my team's more important than the others, which is to say, they're busy spending the 6 billion. And we're busy saying, what about the other 94% of global aid, or 96% of global aid? And so what we do is, yes, we spend money, but we do it only where we can leverage that up. So, one example is we have a $2 billion fund where, I convinced Bill Gates, give me $100 million, I'll get you the 1.9 billion from other donors and the Islamic Development Bank, and then we'll run projects across the Muslim countries, which we call the OIC, which are the countries that the Islamic Development Bank, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which the Islamic Development Bank members countries. So we raise the money from the Arab donors in my region, the Islamic Development Bank, and then we're running projects across those countries. So those are the kind of initiatives I run, where yes, we put some money on the table, but it's all about leverage and what is the other 96% doing, and how can we convince them to get behind what we're trying to do. So, obviously the Middle East is things like that. Pakistan, it's not a donor government, it's how do you get the Pakistani government, because whether it's a rich or poor, you're not going to have impact if the government's not behind what you're trying to do. So that's a different set of work, but with the same essential question. And then in Japan has the G20 this year. They have the Olympics next year. How can we get the Japanese to care more about extreme poverty? So this is the broad range of what we do.
And the G20 is in Saudi Arabia next year.
And it's in Saudi, so the G20 is fully my baby for last year and this year and next year, yeah.
Now, so India is not in your area, but can you just give us, because it's been in the news and all that. So what's the story in India? With the award given to Modi and I mean, my Indian friends tell me it's a wonderful project, but why was it so controversial?
As someone who works in social impact, you have some design choices. You cannot work in every country where extreme poverty exists and fight every political argument. One thing is, I'm going to choose which side. When the politics is very fraught between two countries, you can say, well, I'll just work in that one. That's a design choice. And then you can say what you want about the other one. Another design choice is say, we're just going to protest on all the things that we care. And there's nothing wrong with that. Our design choice is we will work in every country where there's extreme poverty, and we will be apolitical. And the reason that we are often criticized is because actually for a lot of people that's not good enough. They want us to be political. The number of times that people come to me and say, why aren't you helping with the Israel-Palestine thing? Have you seen what Sisi's doing in Egypt? Can't Bill Gates help? And it's true that we have well-known founders who have a voice, but their view is that their ability to have impact is more when it comes to focusing on the technical, focusing on the poverty, focusing on where should money go, and having good relations with all. So in this particular case, there's a lot of criticism of a particular, government. What we're doing is celebrating the progress they've made on extreme poverty, and in particular on sanitation, which is measurable and is factual, and no one's questioned for a second that is the case. But they want us to be involved in a political debate. They're entitled to their opinion, but that's not what our foundation does.
So is this like one of the cases where you put 5% and it's expanded into 100? Like
India is one of the countries where there's money. So if you have a solution, it can be scaled without you having to do it yourself. There are countries in the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, where a huge proportion, 40% of their health budget is paid for by donors. The world is propping up their health system. That's not the case in India. We've done a lot of work on sanitation in India, but it's the government that scaled up that program and delivered it. So in answer to your question, yes, not through getting other donors, but through the Indian government themselves, and that's what we're celebrating.
Now, how did you get to write this book? I know that you had a child and you took a year off, so you had two amazing achievements in one year: a baby and became a father and became a mother.
Well, the test that's yet to be seen is whether I can write a book whilst having a full-time day job and a kid. That I haven't done yet, but if I hadn't had the child, I would have still written the book. Actually, the first half was written before he came along.
Right.
But before I had a child.
Yeah.
The second half was written when I had the opportunity, where I had a lot of the work of really actually being a father who was taking time off and actually taking that responsibility. My wife runs a business, and one of the things we push on in the foundation is gender equality. And so it's, you have the time off, your wife runs a business, just because you are a male, so it was a really interesting experience, and so I did write the second half of it whilst on paternity leave. It was an amazing balance of time. I mean, there's nothing more rewarding than a child, and actually it's intellectually incredibly boring, especially when they can't speak. There's nothing more intellectually rewarding than being in a library and writing a book, but you're not interacting with people you love. So when you're doing that between the two all day, stressful as it is with the deadline for a publisher, is actually an amazing experience. But let me tell you why. Because I said that I was already writing it before a child came along. So it wasn't just, oh, what am I going to do on my year off? That's not where the book came from. You know, one of the themes of the book is the fact that global identity, international identity, and local identity, national identity doesn't conflict. And actually, the data points that out. If you ask people who say that they feel more than a citizen of the world than of their own country, that's about half of the world. About half of the world, if you ask them, they say they feel more like a citizen of the world than of their own country. Now, if you ask them, the ones that feel very strongly about that, which is less than half, how close are you to your country? And you ask the people who say, I am definitely not a citizen of the world, how close are you to your country? It's the same. The same proportion of globalists feel close to their country as people who hate the global system. Now, Donald Trump wants you to think that it's a binary choice. If you're an American, screw the UN, because you have to choose. When you ask people, that's not actually the case. People who care about international collaboration, climate change, the world, all people have the same, all humans have equal value, care about the country just as much as people who absolutely hate all that stuff. Who are the people who care about their country least? It's the people who care about the global system least. In other words, apathy breeds apathy. In other words, the people said, I don't feel strongly either way about the global system. They're the ones who don't feel strongly about their country either.
So it's about social responsibility.
Exactly. Social responsibility breeds social responsibility, rather than it being a zero-sum game. Is I care this much, and the more I care about one, the less I care about the other. It's social responsibility to my town breeds social responsibility to the world. So, I've now thrown out a concept. Let me bring it back to why I wrote the book. So, as someone who fits into, now we've all discovered that there's no conflict between globalism and localism. As someone who spent my career in international development, of course I care about the UK, which is the country I live in. So, when I decided that I'm now married and she doesn't want to go and live in Baghdad, this whole dream about getting involved in politics in Iraq, which was my early dream, it felt like actually not the road that I wanted to take. So the other option is politics in the UK. So I started looking at politics in the UK. And in 2016, Theresa May became the Prime Minister of the UK. And in her first speech at the Conservative Party conference, which is it's almost like the State of the Union equivalent, because there isn't a State of the Union in the UK, but the conference speech is your big annual speech. She said, and I was in the room at the time, if you think you're a citizen of the world, I was like, yeah, that's me. You're a citizen of nowhere, and you don't know what citizenship means. And that was the moment at which I said, I'm not going to get involved in politics. Certainly not for now, because I can't sign up to any of these guys. But I'm going to write a book about what I think about that question, because I think I'm a global citizen. And I don't think that it means I don't understand what citizenship means. It was just my Prime Minister, but we're hearing the same rhetoric from the States, we're hearing the same rhetoric from all over. And so that was the point at which I decided to.
But it seems to me that you're going against the tide in the sense that populism and nationalism is on the rise, and you're calling for
more nationalism.
For more nationalism.
But of a different kind.
Yes.
Exactly. What I think, one of the dichotomies that we're told.
You're calling for a global nationalism.
I am.
Which is very, yeah.
One of the dichotomies that we're told is you either have to care about your country or you have to care about the world. Another dichotomy that we're told is there's tribal people and there's people who are non-tribal. I think probably the psychology works out more in favor of that. I think there are some people who just don't bond with other humans that much and aren't that tribal. But I don't think that's a good analysis of the difference between internationally minded people and Donald Trump voters. I think we're all tribal. I think that if you want international institutions to work well, it's not about, hey, why don't we all just forget our differences? It's we have to really believe we have more in common. And often cosmopolitanism is described as a live and let live. But actually, yes, of course we should live and let live. It's much more than that. We need a common myth of identity. And when you look at common myths of identity, which there are many, hey, we're all Christians or Muslims, religion, right? That brings people together. We all go on Hajj if we're Muslims, fine. And there was a time that Islam was a single political system that spanned a couple of continents. Sure. But by far the most successful myth of belonging, especially if you're regarding about how to make institutions work well, has been the myth of the nation. Now, the nation is a myth. It's a myth that, what is the myth of the nation? The myth is we the people belong together. We've always somehow been together. We always will be. We're an organic unit. We should be self-governing. Our government represents us. And actually, somehow we're a family. It's all lies. Our government represents, we say, China wants to go east, or wants to go west, or China, what does it mean China wants to do that? We've bought into the myth that there is this thing called the government, there's this thing called the people, it's wrapped into the land. That is the myth of the nation. It's been an amazingly powerful myth. Without it, it is not possible to imagine democracy. It is not possible to imagine I vote for a political party, you vote for a political party, I lose, but hey, it doesn't matter because we're all Americans after all, or whatever we are, Brits. And the extent to which nations, countries fail is the extent to which that myth is not actually fully believed in. So the extent to which Lebanese people don't all feel that sense of, hey, we're all Lebanese. The extent to which actually it hasn't yet succeeded. But in many places it has, and those are the places with strong institutions. So my claim is, rather than rejecting tribalism, we need to build a bigger tribe.
Yes, I see. But, okay, so the other thing is, in your book you have those principles.
Yeah.
And what I liked about the book is that I read the title and I disagreed with it immediately. I read every title of every principle and I thought, well, this can't be. And then when I read the text, you were kind of
I started to get a little bit at least.
Yes, because you're not really, you're contradicting the title in many cases. Because you're at the same time a localist and a globalist in that sense. So how do you marry these?
Well, let me start by telling you that I have good intellectual, and obviously we're in a university now. I'm not an academic, but I have good intellectual forebears in my thesis. The arch cosmopolitan, and cosmopolitan is just Greek for citizen of the world. So it means, let's use it as a translation for globalist. Now we started to use it for different things, but when Immanuel Kant said, I'm a cosmopolitan, that's what he meant. He meant, I'm a citizen of the world. And he designed even the hypothesis of a global government. So the arch globalist of modern philosophy is Immanuel Kant. And he never left his hometown of Königsberg. And he said that you need to be a world patriot and a patriot of your own. In that case, it wasn't a kingdom; it was a electorate, I believe, of Brandenburg in his time before the kingdom of Prussia. So I'm not the first person to point this out. The reason that a lot of my principles sound dichotomous is because globalism has been framed in a certain way. What does globalism mean? Firstly, it means rich get richer, and it's an in-group for the rich. It's the Davos elite. And so the idea that actually it's about closing tax loopholes sounds like a paradox or a contradiction. It's actually about freedom of movement. If you're a globalist, you want to erase all borders, right? That's what Steve Bannon will tell you. That's why people like me should be kept out of the conversation. It's because we want open borders, right? So when I say that actually, if you want global cooperation to succeed, you need to have people continue to control their own borders, it sounds like a paradox. Globalism has been presented as a form of westernization. So So when I say that we need to discard the entire concept of the West, it sounds like a paradox. But actually, there's no paradox there. What I'm pointing out, that globalism as it's currently described, firstly, it's just now become an insult. But I unapologetically use that word, because what other word do we have for the idea that the world is the ism, right? You know, and so yes, there's a paradox if you buy into Steve Bannon's narrative about what globalism is about. But I firmly believe that learning the lessons from how nations have been built in the past, if we see the world as a nation in waiting, if we buy into this idea that nations have been successful, the problem is there's 200 of them. What would it look like to build a global community that was as strong a bond? Then I think they become obvious.
So how do you I think it would be good to go through the principles just so that we're all in the same picture. So tell us.
Yeah, so I've already indicated a few of them.
How did you summarize your book to Bill Gates? Because I won't give you more than 5 minutes.
Well, it's actually interesting you say that. So
I know he read it.
He actually read it. So I sent the copy off to Seattle in the hope that he would read it in May. And you know, May passed and June passed. I guess he's busy. July passed. I thought, well, he's never going to read it. And then I got this 1,500 word email from him in August, chapter by chapter, telling me his thoughts. So actually, I got a lot of his time. I mean, he probably reads fast, so it's probably more than 5 minutes, but probably not as long as you and I would take to read it. But I got a lot of his time, which was good. But let me try and give you the elevator pitch. I think the lesson from nationalism is to build the cohesive global community. You need 3 things. One is you need to figure out. So I'm condensing the 6 into 3. I'm grouping them by 2. So one is you need to figure out how you're going to talk about who you are and what this is for. It's the narrative, it's the PR pitch, if you like. It's not enough on its own, but it's super important. Who are we? And where are we going? The second is, you need to show people that you're going to preserve what they hold most dear. A project like communism, which threatens to sweep away the entire social structure and economic structure, is not one that people will buy into. And the third is, you need to actually have an idea for radical change that will improve people's lives. In other words, you can't just keep everything the status quo. So it's how we talk about ourselves, what we need to keep the same, and then what we need to change. How we talk about ourselves, we need to discard this idea of the West as the global in-group. And you know, and there's a lot of people of kind of Middle Eastern or other backgrounds here. You know what the worst word is westernized. My friend Faisal, he's from the Emirates. Don't worry, he's very westernized. And what that means is, he speaks English well, I think he's smart, and to some extent, people working in what they call the global south, he's trustworthy.
Graduated from
because the term westernized, as it's used, implies that all good qualities are a foreign appendage that this essentially barbarous person has learned and will never be Western, but with a bit of hope could be a bit more like us. This is not how, many nations have been built on that principle. You know, the English tried to anglicize the Irish. Many nations have been built on it. The Americans tried to civilize the Native Americans and the African Americans. Many nations have been built on these principles, and the extent to which they failed or been built at great cost and with bloodshed is the extent to which they've had this approach, is that there's an in-group and everyone else has to be eyes. And so that's kind of, let me pause there. Obviously there's lots of details, but that's the first cluster, is how we talk about ourselves. And within that is, you know, avoid turning on some group. Because with that, there's this in-group. Who's the out-group? Who gets exterminated or threatened? And nations have been built in that way. And we are moving towards a potential reality of that at a global level. I mean, Muslim communities simultaneously in many, many countries, in a not coordinated, but amazingly simultaneous set of political decisions, are under a rapidly increasing pressure right now. And actually it could end up being the Jews, but it doesn't happen. I'm not saying it's only the Muslims that are under threat. So, how we talk about ourselves in inclusive ways. The second is, what are we going to hold dear? And this is where some of the paradox comes in, where I say, look, people hold dear their country identity, the fact that they're Hungarian, the fact that they're German, the fact that they're American. The very reason I'm saying the idea of the nation is so powerful, we should extend it globally, means that people care. Nations have worked. People care. So globalization as a process that says we're ending the nation state and wiping away, and now we're all the same. That's what communism tried. The proletariat. No. The United States was built as 50 states, and it's still 50 states, and people care deeply about their text and identity. India, people care deeply about the particular religion and group and language that they come from. Nations can be built whilst respecting the smaller groups within it. And when you look at the world, the smaller groups within it, the biggest category there is the nation states, Germany, China. And so we don't need to wipe these away. And most importantly, people need to control the pace of change, which is immigration. The single biggest argument that is making us lose the arguments for global cooperation is the fact that people feel immigration is under control. So here's the paradox. If you want more immigration, you have to slow it down. So that's what we need to keep the same. What we need to change is, here's two analogies for the world. So I've presented this idea that the world could be viewed as a nation in waiting. It's not a nation, but could we get there? In tax terms, it's like pre-revolution France.
In tax terms?
In tax terms,
yeah.
Our nation in waiting, our world, our global demos, is like pre-revolution France. Now, some of us probably studied a bit of French Revolution in history. Why did the French Revolution happen? One of the main reasons was the nobles didn't pay tax. People rejected a system in which the nobles who had the most money didn't pay tax. That's what this world is like. We're on the verge or halfway through a global uprising in the Philippines, in Pakistan, even in the Panama Papers, Xi Jinping's brother-in-law was caught up. The Prime Minister of Iceland had to resign. Just as one instance, the Panama Papers. Brazil, I mean.
Mexico,
yeah. Yeah, you can go on. The world, and these we've given examples of nation-state governments, but the argument that globalization is a positive force is being undermined by the fact that it has been a way of how is it that you've managed to use global cooperation to have really efficient infrastructure that allows your business to make more money, but you haven't used global cooperation to say, excuse me, Virgin Islands, we've had a meeting and we've decided it's not okay for you to charge zero tax and for Google to have their headquarters in Bermuda and Luxembourg. We have the systems to close down tax loopholes, but we haven't used them. And in the same way that the French Revolution overthrew the Ancien regime, this global system we have is being challenged by tax. The second half of that's tax. And building nations is all about tax, because that's the way that citizens contribute to a government that then funds the projects that they care about. So whilst it sounds like a technocratic sideshow, it's crucial to how you build a community successfully in institutions. But the other is the political, is the decisions about war and peace. So if we're like 1789 France, then our world is like 1000 AD France. I don't know if you know much about French medieval history, but in 1000 AD, the king, let's say Donald Trump, let's say America, he had, he may have been the richest man in the country. He may have been the most powerful one. But his actual domain was basically the area around Paris. And he had decent control maybe over Brittany and Anjou. But Bordeaux had completely revolted. And now he has to send his army down against Provence because the Pope is based in Avignon and disagrees with him. So, yes, we have some kind of king or global system in which there's an element of hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy maintained through force of arms and not through rule of law.
Yeah.
So you can't expect people to buy into that. And of course they haven't. And so we need to develop our political system from a medieval political system, which is better than none at all. So the UN is better than none at all, but not a cabal of 5 nuclear armed veto-holding member states. Now, let me just close this principles thing. I've closed it, but with a chapeau which says, all of the things that I set out are equally achievable at the same time. And specifically on tax and political reform, there's an amazing opportunity around tax. We can move fast on tax because countries have realized they can't tax their own citizens unless we have global cooperation to shut down tax loopholes. So Steve Bannon and Emmanuel Macron are aligned on this issue. As long as Bermuda keeps being the headquarters of Apple, America's screwed, not just the world. So we can, and there's progress being made. Fixing the UN system is not something that's going to happen soon. But as responsible globalists, we can't say, here's our platform, status quo for the UN. It's not okay. It's a battle that we'll win much further down the line. But we have to keep insisting on the fact that this system is not fair. And until we do that, we can't expect, especially if you look at Muslim people, it's like a fifth of the world population. It's much less probably of the economy, but let's say it's probably 10% of the world economy. Zero representation on the UN Security Council. And when Muslims look at the Security Council...
You mean in the Permanent Five?
The Permanent Five, you have the visas. You have the visas. I mean, yeah, but these are the guys who take the decisions. And by the way, if you really want to, then you just wait a couple of years and the other guys will be gone, so you can still have your agenda. The Permanent Five are the guys. They don't even see a single ally. They see America that has a Muslim ban. They see China that has 1 million Uyghurs in detention. They see Russia, which has waged a brutal war against Chechen and other rebels. They see France, where there's a big Islamophobia problem. And they see Britain, where there's a big Islamophobia problem. Not a single ally. I mean, at least the Japanese have an ally in America on the Security Council. So we cannot have a manifesto for fixing the world that doesn't know that, yeah, it's going to be a hard one to fix, but it's on the list.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then
Sorry, I said too much now.
In one of your one of your principles is to define your values and also define your enemy.
Yeah.
So you have defined your enemy today. I was thinking because you mentioned Steve Bannon 5 times.
No.
Yeah. No, but I see a lot of similarity between your ideas and his, because he's at the same time a populist nationalist and a globalist, because he sees populism as a global revolution to overturn the corrupt system.
Yeah, this is the paradox in his argument.
So in a way, you're saying the same thing.
No. We're saying absolutely the opposite thing. But we both share the paradox that you could say, well, you're a globalist, why do you love nation states? To me.
Yeah.
And to him you say you're a nationalist, why are you working internationally?
Yeah.
So, but the paradox is that we're yin and yang with the opposite.
Yeah.
Here's one thing I agree with Steve Bannon, if you literally just take it as a quote. But again, you'll see the yin and the yang. He says, this is a quote, the fight today is between people who see the fight today is between people who want to undermine the nation state and people who see it as a jewel to be polished. When you take that sentence, I agree. We disagree of who's who. He thinks that international cooperation undermines the nation state and that a world of 200 entirely independent countries treats them as a jewel to be polished. So let me ask you this. If you have 200 people in a society, would having a government of rules undermine the 200 people, or would it actually enshrine and treat them as a jewel to be polished? Or would the chaos of the 200 people saying, just go and just be, would that undermine them or treat them like a jewel? And this is the fundamental distinction between me and Steve Bannon. We both agree that it's important that Americans feel American and that American democracy should continue. My case is that a system of global rules where we also feel increasingly as humans and care about each other, protects those groups underneath. And the evidence is strong, which is to say, why is it that suddenly Scotland wants to be independent, that Kurdistan wants to be independent, that Catalonia wants to be independent? Because in the system of rules that we've built, it's never been a better time to be a nation state. Here's the real truth. He thinks America is the strongest country in the world. And he doesn't give a damn about protecting the nation state. He thinks that he'll protect America by being the bully in the room. Now, we all know that having a bully in the room detracts freedom more than it adds, because there are 10 people getting bullied for every one bullying. And so it's actually, it's a fallacy. It's, I have a strong view that my country will be better served by chaos, because in the chaos, someone's going to win, and it'll be me. And here's the reason he's wrong. If you were to go back 200 years and ask who was the bullies in the room, who would say that they felt like that? Yeah, probably America and Britain already did at that time. China thought they were the bully in the room. The Chinese emperor in 1780 something, 1792 or something, wrote to the English king, and he said, I have no need for the barbarous imports of you island people. We are the biggest economy in the world, and by the way, you should address me as your emperor and bow down in reasonable fashion. Within 50 to 80 years, China had been humiliated by the Opium Wars. India, equally, was one of the bullies in the room at the time that the Qinglong emperor wrote that letter. Within 100 years, it wasn't even a country, it was a province of the British Empire. For America not to suffer the same fate over the next 100 years, the best protection for America is to realize it will not always be the bully in the room, and to build an effective system of rules while it still has the loudest voice at that table.
But you have a world government. In terms of the United Nations.
I propose a world government.
You do.
Let me refer to another academic, Max Weber.
Yeah.
He defines the state, because world government sounds crazy, right?
Well, it sounds like it, yeah.
World government sounds crazy.
Sounds like Make America Great Again. World government.
Max Weber defines the state as, all know it, I'm sure, the organization that has monopoly on legitimate violence in the territory. That's all a state is. A state isn't a post office owned by the government in every... It can be. The state can provide education free to every child. But the definition of a state is an organization that has the legitimate monopoly of violence in their territory. So and the government is the organization that runs the state, ultimately the state. So all you need for a global government is for a system globally for deciding legitimately violence. Now we have a system for deciding violence. It's called the UN Security Council. It's just not legitimate. So making the UN Security Council an effective, legitimate governing body, it's all you have to do. You have a global government. So I'm not proposing a single new organization to be founded or a single new building to be built. But right now we have a failed global government, which is to say they claim legitimacy. But it's not legitimate.
Thank you. So let's open it up for...
To answer to your question, the UN has a peacekeeping, they don't have peacemaking. Once they have a peacemaking, it makes them maybe a legitimate world, but the superpower won't allow it, and therefore there is no world governance. And therefore it's like you said, it's a mishmash, both state, whoever the upper hand, and the rest, just follows. It's my view.
Yeah, let's take it as a, I won't respond, that's interjection.
As a peacekeeper, yeah. I work with the peacekeeper anyway. One question for you. You're from Iraq as well, so you always you took a lot of examples from Britain and other. How about Iraq? You didn't live? Yeah.
Lots of examples about Iraq. Let me throw out 2 examples of Iraq that I used in the book. One is really, for me, this was the lesson of the difference between freedom and chaos. The invasion of Iraq was codenamed Operation Iraqi Freedom. So when we talk about nation states should have sovereignty, they should have freedom. So if you talk to the Brits when they're talking about the Brexit, right? They say, no, we don't want to be part of the EU because we want freedom. What Iraq shows is that Operation Iraqi Freedom said, yeah, there's no Saddam Hussein, you're free to walk down the street. You're not free to walk down the street if anyone can walk up to you and shoot you in the head. You're not free to publish a newspaper if anyone can walk into your newspaper and burn the building down because you wrote about their sect or their political group. So I talked a little bit about this, this concept, but to me Iraq was a big lesson there. The other interesting thing about Iraq, which actually more about the Arab world, but certainly my own family, is that we're from Mosul, which is right on the edge of Kurdistan, Turkey, and the Arab Iraq. My family have no historical roots that can be verified to an Arabian tribe. So by the myth of Arab nationalism, it's a little bit dodgy as to whether or not we're Arabs. I mean, Arabs are meant to be the people who speak Arabic, but they spoke Turkish, Kurdish, and Arabic all fluently from birth, because you can't live in Mosul in 1890, 100 years, 100, unless you spoke all of them. So so then nationalism comes along. Are you an Arab, or are you a Turk, or are you a Kurd? This became the important question. And it's interesting, often the marginal cases are the people who get behind it with the most vigor. My family became absolutely Arab nationalists, perhaps because it was a little bit uncertain where they should belong. Another thing that Arabs feel is important is the Islamic identity, because it's often been linked. Christian Arabs, also people who led this Arab nationalism. So it showed me that sometimes people on the margins of a group, maybe to prove they really belong, become the most fervent believers in it. And the third thing about Iraq is it's a perfect example in how to fail to build a nation because you don't have an inclusive story of who we are. I mean, forget about the Kurds. I mean, obviously the Iraqi nation was always built as an Arab nation, not Kurdish. But even the Shia felt that, well, if we're predominantly viewed as Arabs, that means we as Shia are a small proportion of this greater Arab nation. We would much prefer an Iraq, where we're a majority, or some kind of Mesopotamia that included Iran, or some kind of Middle Eastern that included Iran. So even the Shia who did feel that they were Arabs weren't really big on the whole unity with Jordan and unity with Egypt. So the state promulgated for 100 years a version of who we are, ultimately fell apart because it didn't include all people. And that's what we're doing with what globalism is, by saying basically it's the West and then the rest should be westernized. That's what the Iraqi government tried to do. And look at Iraq now. That's the future of the world if we continue down that path. So a few comments on how I see that my Iraqi experience is feeling.
A lot of the ultra-nationalists were always marginal. Atatürk was Macedonian.
Hitler was Austrian.
Stalin was
Georgian, correct. That's a perfect example.
They wanted to prove that they were more Russian.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, please.
No, that's okay. So my question is, the nation state is still a relatively newer phenomenon.
It is.
When you look at the arc, you know, we've come a long way. We now have nation states, but we also have people that are stateless. So how do you then take this identity of being stateless and insert that in a global identity?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the people who are stateless are the people who it's easiest to convince that we need a global system, because they represent one of the issues over which the global system has a legitimate jurisdiction. Part of the talk about nation states should continue. What I mean there is, and this is why I immediately interrupted when you say global government, to make very clear what I really mean by that, is to say global government imagined as like the government of a country just on a global level is a crazy idea. You need to go back to Max Weber to unpick whether that has to be true. Because in order for government to be responsive to people, almost every decision, democracy, the way politics work should continue to work at those smaller levels, and arguably even smaller, as it often happens. And so there's a lot that the global system shouldn't do, that nation states should continue to do, even in this perfect world. But there are some problems that nation states can't deal with. Either they've demonstrated themselves to be unable to deal with it, or even conceptually they couldn't deal with it. You know, the global threat of a disease that could, cross borders and kill all people. Clearly, the global system has to step in. And one of those issues is people who have not been granted a nation state, either because they're refugees or because of political circumstances where they literally had citizenship robbed from them, whether they're Rohingya or Palestinians or whatever. So, and people in this viewpoint, those people themselves, they're almost always crying out, why can't the UN do more? You don't see people sitting in London or Australia saying, why can't the UN system do more? The people are saying that are those people. So they're the easiest to convince. Even though they still feel very Palestinian, they still feel that they're citizens of the world because they need that world identity. They need the help of, from someone else.
I have one follow-up question to that. The idea of the nation state. I mean, if you look at today, Max Weber would just say states have to, the legitimacy of the monopoly of violence, all you need is two things. The ability to make war and to collect taxes. If you look over time, nowadays you have companies that are more powerful than states. So how do you then reconcile this idea of nation state?
So one of the cases I make in the book under this idea of nation state is broader than just a principle I set out, which is that we should continue to respect nation states. Is I actually unpick this argument that the nation state is in decline. The nation state is not in decline. People, I'm not going to mention Steve again because I got, but I mean he's a helpful caricature because actually he's also, as you mentioned, working internationally. So he's in Europe as much as he's in America. But yeah, he's a globalist, anti-globalist. Sorry, I lost the question. It was.
I mean, nowadays you have Amazon.
The idea that the nation state is he wants to claim that the nation state is in decline in order to protect it. And people like you and I often say, yes, well, the nation state, it's very 20th century. And after all, isn't Amazon more powerful than most countries? So it's become a consensus on both sides that the nation state is in decline. And the data doesn't back that up at all. What are the elements of decline? Do people care less about the nation state? There's a very good series of data of large-scale surveys of 45,000 people since 1995, which is about the time since when the nation state is meant to have dipped. And the number of people who care deeply about their country has not dipped for a second. In fact, it stayed the same, but the number of people who say, I should follow my country, whether it is right or wrong, which is a fascinating, I mean, we could spend an hour discussing that question and the assumptions underlying it, has risen significantly over that time. So people are blindly following their countries more than ever and care about them more than ever. So people haven't noticed that the nation state is in decline, other than us intellectuals. Second point, does it collect less tax than before? Does it have less money? No. The nation states of America, of the UK, and of India, of Nigeria, they all collect, although starting from a different point, more money than ever before. Okay, but really the reason the nation state is in decline is because they've given up their sovereignty to these international organizations. Not true. They can take them back at any time, and have done. Britain is in the process of taking back its sovereignty. It never lost its sovereignty. Entered into an agreement whereby, as long as it decided to stay in that agreement, certain functions would be carried out by the EU. Some people have said Brexit's a bad idea. No one's questioned whether Britain has the right to leave the EU. So it never lost power after all. So where is this decline? In fact, if you go back to before the end of the Cold War, nation states many were very oppressed by this Cold War dynamic, whereby you had to be on America's side or Russia's side. If you go back before that, most of the world was colonized. If you go back before that, the nation states didn't exist. So when was this golden age? It's an entire fallacy. Amazon has, I mean, yes, it probably has more profits per year than the Maldives, but actually, when you talk about nation-state governments, they are by far the biggest show in town, even in Chad. What does the rebel group want to do? They want to take over the nation-state. Even in Iraq, the government is the biggest show in town in every country in the world. So I just challenge the fundamental premise that we bought into on both sides of the argument, that there's just this decline.
But there's, I don't want to monopolize.
Yes, so mine, for sure, I think we go back to the metaphysical question and the roots of everything. Why we don't think about the foundation that brings humans together, which is fate. Which is fate. It's really to think how we can bridge the gap between, especially the Abrahamic faith, the Abrahamic religions, and have faith as the common ground to create this global system.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, may I attempt to to rephrase it in the language of my book, which is to say, rather than using the nation as the frame of what global cooperation should look like, rather than trying to create a global nation, you should create a global faith.
Yes.
You should bridge the gaps between faith and use faith. Because don't religions bring people together?
Absolutely.
I mentioned this at the beginning, but let me reiterate. For me, no. Because, for two reasons. Yes, faiths are another way, as are families. Can't we build a global family? What we want is well-functioning institutions. And religions have not brought us functioning institutions on anywhere. They have institutions. They have not brought us well-functioning institutions on anywhere near the scale that this nation has. Now, there are religious institutions that even provide education, that even provide health. At best, they barely approximate the state. But nowhere has a religion been able to create a successful institution like the democratic nation state. But furthermore, the really powerful thing about the nation is that it requires nothing from you other than you believe that you're part of it. In other words, to be an Arab does not require me to pray 5 times a day. It doesn't require me to believe in your God. It doesn't require me to do any of the rituals that religion does. And if you want to have your religion, that's fine. But I would much rather impose on the world only the idea that we belong together, than also the idea that they must believe in this and that, and they must pray and they must do that. So whilst it is an attractive idea, I would say the nation is actually a more powerful organizing principle for where we want global cooperation to go.
So what is the golden standard in this case? You explored elegantly the troubles in the world.
Yeah.
If we want to leave this evening and go home and think about a country or a world,
great question.
That to look at and study today, not
today.
not
Great
something
question.
futuristic.
Yeah.
I think of maybe could it be because countries that have prepared for, that have a tax system that tax the wealthier more, that are open somehow to immigration. Maybe the loan speaking of Sweden, maybe. It's the Scandinavian countries, or what's your choice?
So I'm going to surprise you. I'm going to surprise you. You hit the nail on the head. It's not going to be perfect. I'm not going to show you what's the best country, but the book finishes exactly on this point, which is, if I'm claiming that lessons from the nation state are useful, then what could the future look like in terms of looking at what's going on today? And I set out 3 scenarios, none of which may exactly be the future, but that they hold some, I think, interesting pointers as to how this might develop. One is the Arab nation. It was amazingly successful at creating the myth of common identity. Even as a half Iraqi, I could go to Morocco and people are like, you're basically kind of one of us. They're thousands of miles away and I can't understand a word they say. So we did succeed in creating this idea. We all know, certainly anyone with, kind of the amazing power of that bond as Arabs. But as a political project, it failed. So this is the failure scenario, okay? The failure scenario is that as the world continues to, half of all humans watched the World Cup last year. So there are many things. 1 in 10 people in the world last year got on a plane out of their country, not a domestic flight. 1 in 10 in the world. It's not just, the elite. So because of these things, there's a scenario whereby our common humanity does strengthen, but the political project to actually create a unity, like Arab nationalism, failed. Could well happen. The second scenario is China. This is what a lot of people are afraid of when I talk about, the global, especially the global government. Oh my God, imagine a global nation. It's going to be China, meaning no personal freedom, a state that basically forces everyone to be the same, a spy state that gathers data and uses it to grade the citizens, and all of those things.
Two-child policy.
Which
I agree. I think this is what I agree.
Maybe other intrusive policies into our life. I think that's unrealistic in the short-term version of the world. And the reason is, the world is very difficult to manage. The idea that one person or state or government is going to come along very soon and ensure that people in Guatemala are living identical lives to people in Hong Kong is unrealistic. The level of strength of Han, ethnic Han identity across 900 million people, allows a state that is far more uniform in its policy than the world is going to achieve anytime soon. It's unrealistic. However, if you look for the very distant future, that's a risk to look out for. That we do actually end up getting this kind of monstrous global government that people think of China as. Now, this is my answer to your question, which is the third scenario. It offers hope, but it's realistic. It's not perfect. It's India. Why India? Because India, this is not a compliment to India, by the way, because the world is going to carry on being a messy place, and India is a messy nation. But Sir John Strachey was a British imperial, administrator in the 19th century. He spent most of his life there, and as a senior man, having lived in India, he said in 1888, he said, "This is the first and foremost thing you have to learn about India, that there never was and never has been any sort of unity, social, political, economic, no Indian people, no nation of India. It is not imaginable that the bonds of unity between Indians could ever lead to the development of a national community." He was wrong. And so for the people who tell me that what I'm talking about could never happen, I just think about the people who are wrong about India. Now, it's messy. It's going to be messy. But India now has as many people as the entire world did in John Strachey's day. So India is a planet-sized nation. There was a planet with that many people just 130 years ago. So India is an example of how you can build a planet-sized nation. Not one like China where most people speak Mandarin, but actually one where they don't speak the same language and they don't have the same religion, and there are 80 million tribal people, as they're called, who are very much excluded, and castes, and all of the inequality that continues. So my message to you is, problems will continue, but wouldn't you rather be India than Africa, which is about the same number of people, but divided into all of those different countries? So you have absolute poverty in India, in a state where you're in the same country as Mumbai and all of that wealth, and the possibility to redistribute some of that wealth. Now, 11% of Indian GDP is redistributed as tax at the Indian level, at the federal level, a further 7% at the state level. But if we're talking about India as 11% of GDP, in the UK it's 36%, in the US it's 28%. So it's relatively low, because people don't believe enough in the myth of India to contribute as much, certainly as the Swedes do, that we're all in it together. But 11% is not bad. What does the world collect in foreign aid? 0.000.
Yeah.
So the idea that a world could start, despite all of the challenges that we have and that India continues to have, can start aggregating enough money and political power to start along that road, and the award that we've been controversial as the Gates Foundation we're giving is actually an example that I give in my book, which is the progress they made on sanitation. They have managed to get 96% of people with a toilet. It's not happened in Africa. So there are concrete achievements that this imperfect nation called India, which is a potential model for the world, can make. So it's not a utopia, but it's something that's just about believable. Not tomorrow, but maybe in our lifetimes.
Thank you. Hassan, I know we have to let you go, but I can't resist. One more.
Yeah.
Which is that it's unquestionable that globally peace this is my
It's a great question. I think
because at the core of your book
Mm-hmm.
is that people should believe in the same values.
Yes.
And bureaucrats will not inspire values as much as philanthropists will.
Well, that's an interesting contention that I can very much disagree with. But let me try and, I won't go down that rabbit hole. Other than just to say, I think, as I said from the beginning, the most powerful myth that's ever been spun, that we all belong together, is the myth of the nation. And it wasn't philanthropists who created that, although they may have played a role by saying, hey, I'm American too. It was bureaucrats. So I fundamentally disagree with that sidetrack. But let me come back to your question. First, by giving you a theory of why people have lost trust with politicians. In the 1970s, the mixed economy of quite socialist influenced policy in democratic capitalist countries ran into crisis, especially around the oil embargo and stagflation. And from that crisis emerged what is known as the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus was basically this idea that globalization come home, shrink the state to its essential functions but not to have it running industries, remove subsidies, let the animal spirits of the economy go. It's been the predominant, it first took off in Britain and America, it then took off in all of the countries they had influence in, especially places like Chile and others. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed and China came on board, the entire world has been governed according to this hypothesis of how states and the world should be run, especially economically, called the Washington Consensus. And then 2008 happened. I think that's the reason people have lost trust with politicians. Immigration is another issue, but people worried less about immigration when the economy was booming. So they are linked. So for me, we're just living through a period where the cozy consensus about that we were being told by our leaders has broken down because a lot of countries have suffered various things. And now we're in a period which happens very regularly. The last one I described is in the 70s. Before that was certainly the 1930s was another period, but it got really messy. And those periods are messy periods. Those periods are periods where we don't believe politicians anymore, because the thing they've been telling us for 30 years seems to have broken. So I just think we're in one of those periods. And so the idea that in the long arc of history, the state and politics is now over, and from now on it's just going to be Donald Trump after Donald Trump, I don't believe it. I think we're living through the effects of a particular economic crisis, and we need to find a new consensus about how we should deal with the challenges we face. So that's the which I think is relevant to your question, but it's more the contextualness. To answer more briefly your question about which would you prefer, and for me, the difference between philanthropists helping people and the government is that philanthropists helping people is the law of the jungle, but let's hope some people are nice, and some people will be nice. And let's have a system of rules, because the government is not just a way of capturing resources and handing them out. It's also a way of regulating, so that we don't rely on Bill Gates to make loads of money and then give it away. We say actually everyone has an obligation to pay their tax, or an obligation to contribute to society in whichever way, or not pollute. So I think government is actually the key, and actually you may be surprised to hear that this is what we as a foundation, although this book, this is a personal capacity, but the Gates Foundation has the same view, which is why we don't partner that much with other philanthropists. We partner with government, because that's the game in town, and the only solution. So actually, if you ask Bill Gates, he says, I should be paying more tax. So we are not part of a movement that says, we're the good guys to hell with government. And I, for one, even though speaking in a personal capacity, I'm very aligned with that.
Thank you so much. I know how busy this week was and how valuable your time was.
On the contrary,
Very grateful that you.
I'm really grateful for the invitation, and it's so good to see you again, Nadim, and other friends.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. That's fun. But you're not limited to. Yeah. But there's no I assume it was a relatively, of course, I still wouldn't have anything, not losing my job, but no, sure, I know, it did occur to me